The throne cracked beneath Empress Velithara's feet, not from age but from the ceremonial hammer her own High Council had just brought down upon it. By the authority of the 7 bloodlines, High Arbiter Corveth announced, his voice echoing through the silent chamber, the Empress is hereby stripped of sovereign mandate. Her bloodline is declared dormant. Her claim, dissolved. I watched from the servant's alcove where I had spent the last 3 years of my life, polishing ceremonial blades I was forbidden to touch, learning a language I was forbidden to speak in public, loving a woman I was forbidden to look upon directly. The Velthrim didn't cry. Their biology didn't allow tears in the human sense. But I had learned to read the micro-tremors of their cranial ridges, the way their bioluminescent markings dimmed when grief took hold. Velithara's markings, usually a fierce violet, had faded to something close to ash. The Empress will be escorted to the outer sanctum, Corveth continued, where she will remain until a suitable arrangement can be made. Arrangement. A polite word for exile. Or her execution. The nobles of the 7 bloodlines watched with expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the satisfaction rippling beneath their composed facades. Lady Cythera, of the 2nd blood, in particular, couldn't quite suppress the curl at the corner of her thin lips. This had been coming for months. Velithara had refused to authorize the extermination campaign against the Rim colonies, human settlements, technically under Velthrim protection. She had argued for integration instead of subjugation. She had shown mercy. In Velthrim politics, mercy was weakness. And weakness was death. 2 guards approached the throne platform, their ceremonial spears crossed to block her descent by any path except the one leading to the prisoner's exit. Velithara rose with a dignity that made my chest ache. Even now, even broken, she moved like starlight given form. The human servant, someone called out. I recognized the voice. Lord Cathric of the 5th blood, one of Cythera's most vocal supporters. The Empress's pet. What becomes of it? I felt the weight of 100 alien gazes turn toward my alcove. Standard protocol, Corveth said dismissively. It will be reassigned to the labor pools, or disposed of if no use can be found. I would take it. The voice belonged to Lady Cythera herself. She stepped forward, her silver robes catching the light, her crimson markings pulsing with barely concealed ambition. She looked at me the way one might examine a curious insect. The creature has clearly been trained to high standards. Such training shouldn't be wasted. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the calculation there. I'm sure we could find appropriate uses for it. The implication was clear. Humiliation. Degradation. A symbol of her triumph over Velithara, wearing her former servant as a trophy. I should have been afraid. 3 years ago, when I was pulled from the wreckage of the colony ship Meridian, barely alive, barely human anymore after what the Scourge had done to my family, I would have accepted any fate. Death would have been welcome. But 3 years of watching Velithara rule had changed something in me. 3 years of seeing her stay late, reading petitions, of watching her quietly redirect resources to struggling settlements, of hearing her argue for beings that her entire culture considered inferior. It had rebuilt something I thought the thought Scourge had destroyed forever. No, Dottie. The word left my mouth before I could stop it. In the servant's tongue, which I was forbidden to speak. In the formal register, which I was forbidden to use. The silence that followed was absolute. It speaks. Cathric's voice dripped with disgust. The creature speaks the high tongue. Cythera's eyes narrowed. It seems the former Empress allowed her pet more liberties than protocol permits. How? Telling. I stepped out of the alcove. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to bow, to beg forgiveness. But I kept walking, until I stood at the base of the throne platform, between the guards and their prisoner. I am not property to be reassigned. My voice was steadier than I expected. I am Jonah Mercer, citizen of the Terran Remnant, and I choose to remain with the Empress. Velithara's head turned sharply. For the first time since the hammer fell, something other than grief flickered across her features. Confusion. And something else, something I couldn't name. You cannot choose, Corveth said, his tone caught between outrage and amusement. You are human. You have no standing in this chamber, then give me standing. I met his gaze directly, a violation of protocol so severe that 2 guards actually took a step back. The Velthrim recognize the bond of servitude absolute, do they not? Where a servant binds their fate entirely to their masters. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The bond of servitude absolute was ancient, archaic, rarely invoked even in historical texts. It was considered barbaric, even by Velthrim standards, a relic from an age when servants would follow their lords into death rather than face separation. You don't know what you're asking, Velithara said quietly. Her voice, always so controlled, held a tremor. Jonah, I know exactly what I'm asking. I turned to face her fully, abandoning every pretense of protocol. I'm asking to stay. The outer sanctum is not a place for humans, she said. You would not survive a season, the cold alone. Then I'll die warm. The words came out rougher than I intended. Your radiance. I have spent 3 years watching you fight for people who don't even know you're fighting for them. I have watched you take the hatred of your own court because you refused to become the monster they wanted you to be. I will not let you face whatever comes next alone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lady Cythera laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. How touching. The beast has learned to perform loyalty. But the bond cannot be invoked by humans. The law is clear. The law, Belithara said slowly, specifies that the bond may be invoked by any being capable of understanding its terms. Her ash-gray markings flickered, just slightly. It does not specify species. You cannot be serious. Corveth's composure finally cracked. You would accept this creature's bond, after everything? Belithara descended from the broken throne. The guards moved to intercept her, but she raised one hand, and something in that gesture, some echo of the authority she had wielded for 2 centuries, made them hesitate. She stopped before me. Up close, I could see the exhaustion in the lines of her face, the dim flicker of her markings. She was taller than me by a full head, and in her ceremonial armor, she should have been terrifying. But her eyes, when they met mine, held only a question. You understand that I cannot protect you anymore, she said quietly. That I have nothing left to offer you but hardship and likely death. Her rivals offered me power, I said, loud enough for the chamber to hear. I stayed with her when she lost it. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Belithara closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted in their depths. She extended her hand, palm up, fingers spread, in the formal gesture of bond acceptance. Then let it be witnessed, she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries, that on this day, Jonah Mercer of the Terran Remnant has freely chosen to bind his fate to mine. In honor and in exile. In life and in death. Until the stars grow cold. I placed my hand in hers. Her skin was cooler than human temperature, her grip stronger than I expected. But beneath the formal rigidity of the gesture, I felt her fingers tighten briefly around mine. A squeeze. Barely perceptible. The closest thing to thank you that Veilthram protocol allowed. The guards escorted us from the chamber together, toward whatever fate awaited in the outer sanctum. Behind us, I heard Cythera's voice, sharp with frustrated rage, and Corveth's calmer tones attempting to restore order. Ahead of us, there was only uncertainty. But as we walked through the corridors I had spent 3 years memorizing, Belithara's hand did not release mine. The outer sanctum was a prison designed without cells. Built into the northern cliffs of the capital world, it was a series of chambers carved directly from the mountain stone. Beautiful, in a stark way, but utterly exposed to the elements. The Veilthrim could survive the bitter cold that swept down from the peaks. Humans could not. I had been here for 6 days. I had stopped being able to feel my extremities on day 3. You need to be closer to the thermal vents. Belithara's voice came from the chamber's entrance. She moved like a ghost in the dim light, her markings providing the only illumination in the windowless space. The outer chambers are not suitable for your biology. The outer chambers are where servants are meant to stay. I didn't look up from the fire I was trying to coax from the meager fuel allotment we'd been provided. I won't give the guards reason to report protocol violations. There are no protocol violations in exile. She crossed the chamber and knelt beside me, her movements fluid despite the cold that had me shivering uncontrollably. There is only survival. Come. It wasn't a request. Her hand closed around my arm, carefully I noticed, mindful of how easily human skin could bruise, and she guided me deeper into the sanctum, toward the chambers that had been carved closer to the geothermal activity that made this mountain habitable at all. Her chambers were warmer. Not comfortable by human standards, but warm enough that my violent shivering began to subside. She released my arm and moved to the small alcove where a Veilthrim would normally rest. They didn't sleep as humans understood it, but they entered periodic states of reduced consciousness. Sit, she said, gesturing to a raised platform near the thermal vent. Rest. You have pushed yourself past reasonable limits for days. I'm fine. You are lying. Her voice held no accusation, only statement of fact. I can see your heat signature dimming. Another day of exposure, and you will begin the process of thermal cascade failure. Your organs will shut down in sequence. You will die, and the bond you invoked will have meant nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She was right. I knew she was right. The question emerged before I could stop it. You didn't want me here. You said as much in the throne room. Belithara was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was carefully measured. I did not want you here because I did not wish to see you suffer for my failures. That is not the same as not wanting you. The distinction hit me harder than the cold. For 3 years, she continued, I watched you. A human, stripped of everything, thrown into a world that viewed you as less than nothing. I expected you to break, to surrender to despair, as so many in your position have. Instead, you learned. You adapted. You became someone of quiet dignity in a place designed to strip dignity away. She turned to face me, and for the first time since our exile began, I saw something vulnerable in her expression. You asked me, in the throne room, if I understood that I had nothing left to offer you. I need to ask you the same question. Her markings pulsed, dim, but steady. Why did you stay, Jonah? Truly? The honest answer was complicated. It involved grief and loss, and the particular way she had looked at me once, across a crowded ceremonial hall when she thought no one was watching. It involved 3 years of small kindnesses I was never supposed to notice, extra rations appearing in my quarters, duty rotations that kept me away from the cruelest overseers, medical care that servants weren't technically entitled to. Because you saw me, I said finally. Not as a human, not as a servant, just as a person. No one has looked at me that way since the scourge took my family. Velithara's markings flickered. The scourge. The plague that decimated your colony ship. It wasn't just a plague. The words came out rough. I had never told anyone this, had never been asked, never been given the opportunity. My wife, my daughter. I watched them change. Watched the pathogen rewrite who they were until they didn't recognize me anymore. And then I watched them die, knowing that the last thing they felt was confusion and fear in this terrible emptiness where their love used to be. Silence. The thermal vents hissed softly in the darkness. When I was brought to the capital, I continued, I wanted to die. I was looking for an opportunity. And then I saw you in the receiving hall, arguing with your advisors about the RIM colony integration program. You were defending people you'd never met, would never meet, simply because you believed it was right. I forced myself to meet her eyes. That was the first time since the meridian that I felt something other than grief. You made me want to live, Velithara. Not because you tried to, because you simply existed as someone worth believing in. She said nothing, but she moved closer, and her hand found my shoulder. The touch was tentative, uncertain, nothing like the confident authority she had wielded as Empress. Among my people, she said quietly, direct emotional expression is considered childish. We are taught from birth to mask what we feel, to present only the face that serves our position. It is one of the reasons we struggle to understand humans. Your willingness to feel openly, to love openly. We interpret it as weakness. Her hand tightened slightly on my shoulder. I have spent 200 years wearing masks. I have forgotten what my own face looks like beneath them. Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. But when I look at you, I find myself wanting to remember. Before I could respond, there was a sound at the chamber entrance. We both turned to find a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the outer corridor, small for a Velthrim, young, with markings that glowed a familiar shade of violet. Velithara's voice sharpened with surprise. You should not be here. The young Velthrim, a girl, I realized, barely past adolescence by their standards, stepped into the chamber. Her features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Velithara's, though her expression held none of the former Empress's careful control. My tutors believe I am studying in my chambers. This's voice trembled slightly. Mother, they're saying you will be executed. They're saying Lady Cythera has called for your blood debt to be collected. Blood debt. The old law that allowed victims of perceived dishonor to demand the death of the offender. If Cythera was invoking it. Velithara's hand fell away from my shoulder. When she spoke, her voice had returned to its formal register, empty of the warmth that had been there moments before. You should not have come. If you are discovered here, I don't care. This across the chamber with the reckless speed of youth, and threw her arms around her mother. The gesture was so human, so unexpected, that I felt my throat tighten. I won't let them take you, I won't. For a moment, Velithara stood rigid in her daughter's embrace. Then, slowly, her arms rose to return the hold. Her markings brightened, just slightly, and I saw something in her expression that I had never seen before. Fear. Not for herself, but for the child she was holding. Listen to me carefully, Velithara said, her voice low. Cythera's claim will be heard before the full council in 3 days. Whatever happens, you must not oppose it publicly. You must appear loyal to whoever takes power after. Do you understand? I understand that you're asking me to abandon you. I'm asking you to survive. Velithara pulled back, gripping her daughter's shoulders. The bloodline does not end with me. You carry it forward. That is more important than any single life, including mine. And what about him? This's gaze cut toward me, hostile and searching. The human who supposedly chose exile over comfort. Is he worth more than your bloodline too? Thissa, he's not even one of us. The girl's voice cracked. He's nothing. Less than nothing. And you're going to die for him? I'm not dying for him. Velithara's voice remained steady. I am dying for decisions I made long before he arrived. Decisions I do not regret. The girl fell silent, her markings pulsing with agitated light. Finally, she turned and looked at me directly, something that, under normal circumstances, would have been a severe breach of caste protocol. Why? She demanded. Why did you stay? It was the same question her mother had asked. I gave the same answer. Because she's worth staying for. Thissa stared at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. You're going to die here, she said flatly. You know that, probably, and you don't care. I care. I met her gaze, without flinching. I just care about her more. The girl's markings flickered in a pattern I didn't recognize. Then she turned back to her mother. There might be a way, she said quietly. Cythera's blood debt claim. It's based on the accusation that you dishonored the Empire by refusing the extermination order. But the old laws also allow for a champion to answer blood debt challenges. I know the laws, child. Then you know that anyone bound to you by absolute servitude has the right to stand as champion in your place. I felt the temperature. In the chamber drop, not physically, but in some other way. Velithara's face went completely still. No, it's his right, no. The word came out with a force I had never heard from her before. I will not allow him to die for me. That is not why he is here. Then, why is he here? Thissa's voice rose. You keep saying he chose this, that he chose you, but if you won't let him actually do anything, what was the point? He just gets to watch you die instead of dying with you. How's that better? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Velithara turned away from both of us, facing the thermal vents. Her shoulders, usually so straight, seemed to curve inward. Leave us, she said quietly. Return to your chambers, before you are missed. We will speak again before the council meets. Thissa hesitated, then moved toward the entrance. At the threshold, she paused. He looks at you the way father used to, she said, before he died. I'd forgotten what that looked like. Then she was gone, leaving only the hiss of the vents and the weight of everything unspoken. Velithara didn't turn around. But her voice, when it came, was barely audible. Her father was killed in the last war with the consortium, 20 years ago. Thissa was barely old enough to remember him. I'm sorry, don't be. He was a good man by Velfram standards, honorable, loyal. A pause. He never looked at me the way Thissa described. Our marriage was political. There was respect, perhaps even affection, but never. She trailed off. I waited. This is wrong, she said finally. What I feel, when I look at you, it violates every principle I was raised to uphold. You are human. was Empress. The gap between us should be insurmountable. I rose from the platform and crossed the chamber to stand behind her. Close enough to touch, but I kept my hands at my sides. Should be, I said. But isn't. She turned. In the dim light of her own markings, her face was a study in conflicting emotions. Fear and hope. Grief and something that looked almost like desperate hunger. If I let you stand as champion, she whispered, you will die. Cythera will choose her own fighter, someone trained from birth for combat. You cannot win. Maybe not. I reached out, slowly, and took her hand. Her fingers curled around mine, cold and strong and trembling slightly. But I can buy time. Make enough of a showing that the council has to take notice. Plant doubt, die. You would die for doubt. I would die for you. The words came easily, because they were true, but I'd rather live. Which is why I'm going to need you to teach me everything you know about Velfram combat before the council meets. For a long moment, she simply looked at me. Then, impossibly, she laughed. A soft, broken sound that held no humor but also no despair. You are the most unreasonable creature I have ever encountered. Is that a yes? Her free hand rose to touch my face. Her fingers traced my cheekbone, my jaw, the corner of my mouth, mapping features that must have seemed impossibly alien to her. That is a we begin at dawn, she said. And may whatever gods watch over your foolish species have mercy on us both. The council chamber had been transformed. Where the ceremonial throne had stood, there was now a fighting circle marked in luminescent compounds that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. The 7 bloodlines were arranged in their traditional positions around the perimeter, their representatives seated on elevated platforms that ensured they could witness every moment of the proceedings. Lady Cythera's champion stood at the eastern edge of the circle. His name was Vorath, And he was everything I was not. 7 feet of genetically optimized combat potential, his markings the deep crimson of the warrior caste, his body covered in the scars that marked him as a veteran of the consortium. Wars? Bye? I stood at the western edge, wearing borrowed armor that didn't quite fit and carrying a blade that felt wrong in my hands, despite 3 days of training. 3 days. Velithara had taught me everything she could in 3 days. It wasn't enough. We both knew it wasn't enough. But it was what we had. The terms of blood debt challenge are witnessed, High Arbiter Corveth intoned. The accused, former Empress Velithara of the Third Blood, stands charged with dishonoring the Empire through weakness and collaboration with inferior species. The champion for the accuser shall fight until death or submission. The champion for the accused shall do likewise. Let the matter be settled in blood. Across the chamber, I caught Velithara's eye. She was seated in the prisoner's section, her wrists bound in ceremonial restraints, her face carefully blank. But her markings pulsed once, a signal we had agreed upon. Stay alive. That's all you have to do. Stay alive long enough. The signal to begin was a single tone from the Arbiter's staff. Vorath moved before the sound had finished fading. He was fast, faster than anything human could match. I barely managed to deflect his first strike, and the impact traveled up my arm like an electric shock. His second strike came from an angle I hadn't anticipated, and I felt the blade slice through the outer layer of my armor. First, blood. Less than 10 seconds in, I retreated, putting distance between us, trying to remember Velithara's lessons. The Veilthrim fought in patterns, complex sequences of attack and defense that were drilled into them from childhood. If I could identify which pattern he was using, I could predict his movements. Vorath pressed forward, his blade a blur of motion. I blocked, dodged, retreated again. The council watched in silence, their expressions ranging from bored dismissal to active contempt. The human fights like a cornered prey animal, someone commented. I thought it might be Cathrek. This will be over soon. They weren't wrong. Vorath was herding me toward the edge of the circle, limiting my movement options. In moments, I would have nowhere left to go. Velithara's voice echoed in my memory. When you have no path to victory, choose the path your enemy doesn't expect. I stopped retreating. Vorath's next strike was designed to finish me, a sweeping blow that would have severed my head if I hadn't moved. But instead of blocking or dodging, I stepped into it, inside his guard, too close for his blade to be effective. My own blade found the gap in his armor at the hip joint. Not a killing wound, but enough to make him stagger. The chamber went silent. Vorath pulled back, his markings flaring with what I recognized as anger. First blood belonged to him, but I had wounded him, something no one expected. Clever, he said, speaking for the first time. His voice was surprisingly soft for such a large creature. You fight without honor, human. You fight to survive rather than to win. Where I come from, I replied, surviving is winning. He came at me again, faster than before, and this time I couldn't evade. His blade caught my shoulder, cutting deep. I felt the warmth of blood running down my arm, the sudden weakness as damaged muscles failed to respond. I fell. The chamber erupted in murmurs. I could hear Sathira's satisfied voice somewhere above me, calling for the Arbiter to declare victory. But Vorath hadn't delivered the killing blow. Instead, he stood over me, his blade raised but motionless. Submit, he said quietly. You fought better than I expected. There is no shame in yielding to a superior opponent. I looked past him, toward the prisoners' section. Velithara was on her feet despite her restraints, her markings blazing with an intensity I had never seen. Her lips were moving, forming words I couldn't hear across the distance. But I knew what she was saying. The same thing she had said every night in the sanctum when she thought I was asleep. Please, please don't let him die for me. Your Empress, I said, forcing the words through pain, taught me something about you Veilthrim. You don't believe in anything you can't see. Show them strength, she said, and they'll never forget you were once weak. Hide weakness, and they'll always wonder. Vorath's eyes narrowed. What are you? I struck. Not with my blade. My sword arm was useless. But in falling, I had managed to keep my offhand free. The small knife I had concealed there, against every rule of formal challenge, found his thigh, severing the major artery that Velithara had shown me on training diagrams. Vorath collapsed. The chamber exploded. Dishonorable. Sathira's voice cut through the chaos. The human used a concealed weapon. The challenge is void. But I wasn't listening. I was crawling toward Vorath, who lay on his side, his markings fading as his blood poured across the luminescent circle. His eyes found mine, and I saw something there that looked almost like respect. Finish it, he said. You've earned the right. I shook my head. The knife fell from my trembling fingers. I didn't come here to kill you, I said. I came here to survive. You can do the same. I turned my back on him, on my fallen enemy, on the screaming nobles, on everything, and began pulling myself toward the prisoner's section. My shoulder was bleeding badly. My vision was starting to fade at the edges. But I could see Velithara, her hands straining against her restraints, her carefully composed face finally cracking as tears. Real tears, I would learn later, something her species almost never produced. Streamed down her cheeks. The challenge is forfeit, Cythera screamed. Both champions have fallen. The blood debt stands. No. The voice came from the elevated platform where the Third Blood's representatives sat. A figure rose, elderly by Velthrim standards, her markings faded to pale lavender, but her bearing still commanding. Elder Viantha, Corveth said, clearly struggling to maintain order. This is not, I invoke the right of elder witness. Vantha's voice cut through the chaos with practiced authority. As eldest surviving member of the Third Blood, I have the right to speak on matters affecting our lineage. Silence fell. Even Cythera seemed uncertain how to respond. The human champion has demonstrated something our traditions have forgotten. Vantha descended from her platform, moving slowly toward the circle. He came here not to kill, but to survive. When his enemy fell, he offered mercy instead of execution. And when he had nothing left to fight with, he still crawled toward the one he swore to protect. She stopped at the edge of the circle, looking down at me with ancient eyes. That is not weakness, she said. That is love. And love, whatever its form, is not the enemy of honor. It is honor's deepest root. The chamber was utterly still. I call for a new vote, Vantha continued. Not on the blood debt. That was an insult to our traditions from the beginning, and we all know it. I call for a vote on whether the former Empress's actions truly constituted dishonor, or whether they demonstrated a vision our empire desperately needs. This is unprecedented, Corveth began. So is what just happened in that circle. Vantha gestured toward me, toward the blood pooling beneath my failing body. A human being, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, chose to stand for one of us. Chose to bleed for one of us. Chose to die for one of us. Her gaze swept the assembled nobles. When was the last time any of you could say the same? I heard voices raised in argument. I heard Cythera's protests growing more desperate. I heard something that might have been agreement from unexpected quarters. But I couldn't hold on any longer. The darkness at the edges of my vision was spreading, and the pain had faded to something distant and cold. The last thing I saw before consciousness left me was Velithara, finally breaking free of her restraints, rushing toward me through a chamber full of chaos. The last thing I felt was her hands cradling my face. The last thing I heard was her voice, no longer formal, no longer measured, stripped down to something raw and human in its desperation. Stay with me, please, Jonah, please stay with me. Then, there was only darkness. I woke to warmth. Not the desperate, precarious warmth of the outer sanctum, but something genuine, soft fabrics beneath my back, gentle light filtering through translucent panels, the quiet hum of medical equipment doing its work. You are awake. Velithara sat beside me, close enough that I could have touched her if I'd been able to lift my arm. She looked different somehow, not diminished, but changed. The rigid formality I had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something softer. More open-eyed. The vote, I managed. My voice came out as a croak, carried by 4 bloodlines to 3. A ghost of a smile crossed her features. Cythera's coalition collapsed when Elder Viantha spoke. It seems that watching a human nearly die for their former enemy was enough to make some of my critics reconsider their positions, so you're not restored to the throne. That was never truly possible. Too many compromises would have been required, too many deals with those who wished me harm. She reached out and took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine, but I have been exonerated. My bloodline's honor is intact, and I have been offered a position on the Council of Integration, a new body formed to oversee relations between the Empire and human settlements. I processed this slowly. That sounds like what you wanted all along. It is more than I hoped for. Her grip tightened. And I have you to thank for it. I didn't do much. Got stabbed. Fell over. Crawled around on the floor a bit. The laugh that escaped her was nothing like the broken sound from the sanctum. This was genuine, warm and surprised and utterly unguarded. You survived, she said, against every expectation. Against every odd. You looked at an opponent who could have killed you in seconds and found a way to walk away. That is what convinced them, Jonah. Not courage, or skill, or even the theatrics of the moment. It was the simple, undeniable fact that you refused to die. She leaned closer. Her free hand came up to brush hair away from my forehead, and I noticed that her markings were glowing again, not ash gray, but a deep, steady violet. We have a saying among my people, character reveals itself in crisis. What you revealed in that chamber changed how many of them see humans forever. Her voice dropped. What you revealed changed how I see myself. Velithara, let me finish. She took a breath, and I could see her fighting old instincts, old training that told her to mask what she was feeling. For 200 years I told myself that duty was enough. That serving my people well was a substitute for genuine connection. I watched my husband die without ever having truly known him. I raised my daughter behind walls of protocol and expectation. I existed, but I was not alive. Her eyes met mine, and I saw tears gathering there again, the same impossible tears that had fallen in the council chamber. You made me remember what living feels like, she said. Not because you saved me, because you saw me. The real me, beneath all the masks and titles and responsibilities. And you loved what you saw. The word hung between us, finally spoken. I don't know what comes next, I said. I don't know what a human and a Veilthran. I don't know how this works. Neither do I. She smiled, a real smile, the first I had ever seen from her. But I spent centuries pretending I had all the answers. Perhaps it's time to try something different. She leaned down slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. The kiss was brief and tentative, complicated by the differences in our biology. Her lips were cooler than a human's, her taste unfamiliar. But beneath the strangeness, there was something unmistakably right about it. When she pulled back, her markings were pulsing brighter than I had ever seen them. My daughter is waiting outside, she said. She has asked to speak with you. She still hates me. She is confused. Thissa spent her whole life being taught that humans were inferior, lesser beings, barely worth notice. Watching you challenge that belief has not been easy for her. Velithara released my hand and rose, but she is young. And the young have an easier time admitting they were wrong. At the doorway, she paused. The council has offered us quarters in the diplomatic wing. Proper quarters, not a prison carved into a frozen mountainside. A hint of her old formality crept back into her voice. I have arranged for you to have your own chambers, of course. Protocol still matters even if, Velithara. She stopped. I spent 3 years sleeping in a servant's alcove. I spent a week nearly freezing to death. I'm pretty sure I actually died for at least a minute on that chamber floor. I met her eyes. If you're going to invite me to move in with you, just ask. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then the smile returned, warmer than before. Jonah Mercer of the Terran Remnant, she said. Will you stay with me? The question echoed everything that had brought us here. Her rival's offers of power, my choice to remain by her side through exile and battle and everything in between. But it also meant something new. Something forward-looking rather than defensive. Yes, I said. For as long as you'll have me. She nodded once, that Veilthran gesture of formal acceptance that I had come to know so well. But as she turned to leave, I saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was entirely human. The door opened, and a smaller figure slipped through before Velithara could exit. Thissa stood at the foot of my bed, her markings dim with uncertainty, her hands clasped in front of her in an attitude I recognized as nervous. My mother says you saved her life, she said, without preamble. I did what needed doing. She also says you love her. I considered lying. Considered deflecting with humor or false modesty. But this girl had watched her father die, had watched her mother's empire crumble, had stood before the full council to argue for a human's right to fight as champion. She deserved honesty. Yes, I said. I love her. Thissa was silent for a long moment. Then she crossed to the chair her mother had vacated and sat down, her posture still stiff but her expression thoughtful. Teach me, she said. Teach you what? How you did it. The fighting, I mean. She looked away, her markings flickering with something that might have been embarrassment. You shouldn't have survived that challenge. By any logical measure, you should have died in the first 30 seconds. But you didn't. You found a way. Your mother taught me the patterns. I just applied them wrong. Exactly. Thissa's eyes met mine, and I saw a sharp intelligence there that reminded me painfully of Velithara. You applied them wrong, and it worked. That means there's something in human thinking, in your way of seeing problems, that our training doesn't account for. I want to understand it. I studied her for a moment, this strange girl who had started as a hostile stranger and was now asking me to be her teacher. It won't make you popular, I warned. Taking lessons from a human, I don't care about popular. Her chin lifted, a gesture of defiance that was pure adolescent bravado. My mother is going to change the way our people see humans. I want to help her. And I can't help her if I don't understand. I thought about my daughter, The one I had lost to the Scourge. She would have been close to This's age now, if she had lived. The thought still hurt, but it was a different kind of hurt than it used to be. Cleaner, somehow. All right, I said. When the doctors clear me, we'll start. But I'm warning you, human fighting is ugly. No honor, no patterns, no elegance. Just survival. Thissa nodded, a fierce light kindling in her markings. I'm tired of elegance. She rose and headed for the door, but paused at the threshold. For what it's worth. I think I understand now. Why you stayed. Yeah? She glanced back, and for just a moment, she looked impossibly young. She smiles now. Real smiles. She never used to do that. A pause. Thank you for giving that to her. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of medical equipment and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of hope. Through the translucent panels, I could see the spires of the capital rising against a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Somewhere out there were the rim colonies, human settlements that would finally have a voice in imperial affairs. Somewhere out there were the remnants of the consortium, and the Scourge, and 1,000 other threats that would need to be faced. But here, in this room, there was warmth. There was recovery. There was the promise of a future I had never expected to have. The door opened again, and Velithara returned, carrying a tray of food that looked suspiciously like human comfort food, bread and soup, and something that might have been fruit. The medical staff has approved your diet, she said, setting the tray beside my bed. Though they expressed significant confusion about why humans voluntarily consume heated liquid with their meals, it's called soup. It's good for the soul. Humans don't believe in souls. Some of us do. I reached for her hand again, and she gave it willingly. Besides, you're one to talk. You didn't believe in love until a week ago. Her markings pulsed with that warm violet glow. I have always believed in love. I simply never expected to find it. She settled into the chair beside me, her fingers intertwined with mine. Especially not with a stubborn, irrational, impossibly brave human who refuses to die when it would be sensible to do so. Would you have preferred I die sensibly? Never. Her voice was fierce, soft, and utterly certain. Never that. Outside the window, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small drama playing out beneath them. But for the first time since the Meridian, since the Scourge, since everything I had lost, the universe felt less empty. I had found something worth staying for. And against all odds she had found me.